Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler, Episode 91. Today, the Amateur Traveler interviews Rudy Maxa, Public Radio's Savvy Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no. 15-hour flight, oh, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. The first story I have for you today I first saw on airtravel.about.com, but it comes from Reuters. If I may quote the article, Americans like the tax collector better than airlines, according to a customer satisfaction survey released on Tuesday. Weighed down by delays, grumpy employees, and lost bags, U.S. Airlines scored 63 out of a possible 100 on the University of Michigan's Customer Satisfaction Index. That is a touch below the 65 awarded to the bureaucracy-laden U.S. Internal Revenue Service. The airline's score, down 2 points from last year, was the lowest for the industry since 2001 and reflects growing dissatisfaction with the travel industry. If you've flown recently, you're probably not surprised. And speaking of customer satisfaction, you may be aware that this podcast is part of the Podshow network at podshow.com, and Podshow is also looking at improving the quality of its services, and so they have created, in Podshow style, the Suck Less Zone. At suckless.podshow.com, you can go to suckless.podshow.com and enter your comments in terms of what they can do to improve the services. And when you do that, you'll be entered into a contest to win valuable prizes. So you might want to check that out. suckless.podshow.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Rudy Maxa. Rudy is the host for Smart Travels, Europe with Rudy Maxa on PBS, also The Savvy Traveler on public radio, a contributor to National Geographic Traveler. He blogs at maxablog.com. You've produced podcasts, National Geographic Traveler's magazine's 50 Walks of a Lifetime. You've been the host of Europe to the Max. Welcome to the show.
Well, nice to be here. Thank you, Chris. Sounds exhausting, frankly.
Yeah, I've read a lot more about you, and sometime we'll talk about your Pulitzer Prize and such, but it's only a half-hour show, so...
I understand. Well, I had two careers. You're right. I used to be an investigative reporter and magazine writer in Washington, D.C., and then sort of by mistake seeked into travel writing. So we'll talk travel. This is the amateur traveler and not the amateur gossip monger.
That's actually one of the things I want to talk about. A lot of my listeners will know you as a travel author, as a travel host. But I'm guessing that in first grade, when you wrote out what you want to do when you grew up, that wasn't it.
No, it wasn't. It's sort of funny. I have the application I made in college, my senior year in college, for an internship at the Washington Post. And it asked what my interests were. Obviously, my interest was in being a reporter or a writer. But it said, what are your particular interests? And I said, con men, rogues, and hustlers. And over the course of the first 22 years of my career in Washington, D.C., I did get that internship at the Post and stayed on at the Washington Post by sheer good luck, believe me, for 13 years, and then did 9 years as a senior writer at Washingtonian. And during that year, I wrote a book about a con man. I sort of became Boswell to Hustler founder Larry Flint, and certainly wrote about a lot of rogues. And I remember finding that in the personnel department years after I was at the Post, looking at it going, oh, my God, I was just winging it, filling out an application, but it actually came true. So in Washington, D.C., particularly folks my age in their 40s and 50s would know me as a writer at the Post and at Washingtonian, you're right.
So how did you get into travel as a career now?
Well, about 15 years ago, when I was writing at Washingtonian, the city magazine in Washington, I got a call from what was then a young business show on public radio called Marketplace. It was probably about a year old. This guy who called me, J.J. Yore, who is now a big poobah at Marketplace and an executive at Minnesota Public Radio, which owns the show Marketplace. Marketplace, by the way, along with Prairie Home Companion and Car Talk, are one of the most successful shows on public radio. At any rate, I didn't know what Marketplace was. I walked to work. I very rarely listened to the radio because I was rarely in a car. And they called me and said, we'd like you to do political commentary, this guy J.J. Yore said. And I said, I don't do political commentary. I mean, I certainly follow politics assiduously, but I don't have that Pat Buchanan, John McLaughlin, Chris Matthews point of view, which I think you have to be a good political commentator. I mean, you have to have some comments to make, I said, I just wanted whoever's in the center ring to be interesting so I can write about him or her. I don't care, I don't care what you knowing what I think about them. And they were sort of frustrated, and he called a couple of times, and he got me to do one commentary. All he wanted me to do was like 2.5 minutes every other week. And I said, I'm just not doing political commentary. It's not my interest. By the way, I wasn't a radio guy. I was a print guy. I had hosted a weekend talk show on the NBC radio station for, a couple of years earlier. But it was sort of a thing I did on the side, and it was sort of a fluke, and, big deal. I had no training in radio, whatever. Finally, in frustration, JJ said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, JJ, I don't want to do anything. I mean, you're talking about $75 every other week. You're talking about radio. I'm a print guy. He said, well, don't you have any hobbies? And I thought, well, I collected stamps as a kid. I played the accordion because I grew up partly in Germany. I mean, I played tennis. But I thought my only passion really was travel, my passion in that regard. He said, well, travel? And then I sort of warmed up to the topic, and I was the guy who would read that small type in all the newspaper ads that airlines used to have to run before the Internet. That agate type where they said, yeah, sure, it's $78 to fly from D.C. to L.A., but only if you're a Libra born on Monday. And I said, it's amazing to me how sophisticated people travel all the time, have no idea about how tickets are priced, what they can do with an airline ticket, how they can get into first class without, buying a full fare first class ticket. Why don't I do consumer travel commentary? And J.J. Yore said, we're a business show. We're not interested in that. And I said, well, business people travel, and travel's big business. And he said, send me, and of course, send in that days meant type it up and put it in the mail. Send me, like 20 ideas for little commentaries, and, we'll basically never call you back. And to this day, I don't know why I bothered, frankly. I mean, I wasn't like, oh, yeah, gee, I get to be on the radio. I don't know. Maybe I just thought, hey, this guy doesn't see how brilliant I am. So I sent 20 ideas, and he called back. He said, well, we had a meeting, and I read these ideas out, and, people were sort of interested. Why shouldn't you drink the water on an airplane? And how do you get into first class without a first-class ticket? A friend of mine named Peter Greenberg, who's now the Today Show travel editor, was writing a column for the LA Times called The Savvy Traveler. I love that moniker. I said, could I use it for radio? He said, sure. And so I started doing these every other week commentaries called The Savvy Traveler. And that's how it started.
Now, I read a quote that you said, a friend once said about you that you would check into a Motel 6 and ask for an upgrade.
That was Peter Greenberg, actually,
Okay.
The gentleman I just mentioned. Yeah, I mean, I think what he was saying was that I tried to sort of figure out how to game the system when it comes to travel. As you know, most travelers' rights, well, it's like military music or military cooking, Travelers' rights is an elusive concept, and most travelers have no idea if they have any rights because there are so few. I try to find. In fact, I just did check into a Motel 6 in Flagstaff, Arizona, not 1 week ago, and I didn't get an upgrade. But it was 1:30 in the morning, and I didn't have a lot of choice of rooms. So.
If you had 3 tricks that you wish that travelers knew, I can't understand why people don't know this. What would they be?
I think the first one would be that despite the fact most travelers, if you're going to buy an airline ticket, know that you'll probably, in most cases, get a cheaper fare if you book ahead and have a better chance of getting the flight you want, not to mention the seat you want. When they think of a trip and know they want to go, they take, presuming it's a ways out, they take days, if not weeks, to pull the trigger and make the reservation. I've often said that most of us, or many of us, I don't know, most Americans, but many Americans know right now, we're talking in May now, most Americans know where they want to be and when they want to be at some place for Thanksgiving. Whether it's, family, going to see their family, going to see their kids, going to see their best friend, whatever, their loved one. We already know where we want to be for Thanksgiving. But most Americans will wait till mid-October, even later, to say, yeah, I better get that airline ticket. And then they find out that, they can't leave on Wednesday night after work for Thursday's festivities and then fly back on Sunday. All those seats are taken, and boy, it sure is expensive. The last time I flew there wasn't this much. If you know where you want to be for Thanksgiving, if you're 90 or 100% sure where you want to be for Thanksgiving, book it now. Book it now and get the flight you want at a cheaper fare. And I think we probably all heard stories of friends. Well, I went online. My dream is to go to Paris. I went online. There was a fabulous ticket for $700, $500, $400 round trip. I talked to my wife. Then I called the guy. I talked to my boss. And I went back 2 hours later, 2 days later, 2 weeks later, and it was $900. It was $1,000. So rule number 1 is when you want to travel, make the command decision to pull the trigger and do it. That's my first advice. I think number 2, what would the third thing be? The third thing would be that there's a lot of options. I mean, I love Expedia and Travelocity and Orbitz and other websites that show you a side-by-side comparison of most flights, but they don't show you everything. They don't show you that if you're looking for a really cheap ticket from New York to London, that Air India happens to have a daily flight en route to Delhi. And if they have room, they'll almost give away they don't give it away, but it's a much cheaper flight from New York to Delhi on Air India than it would be on the airlines you might think of, like British Airways, American Airlines, Virgin Atlantic, blah, blah, blah. So you've got to dig deeper. You've got to look deeper, and you have to be creative at times. Is there a third thing I would tell people? Oh, gosh, I guess it would be a general zeitgeist kind of thing, which is to say that, this is not an original observation by me. Paul Theroux, I was once interviewing him when I was doing the Savvy Travel radio show, and he said, it's the things that go wrong on trips that you remember. That's when things start getting interesting. Mm-hmm. So don't be too afraid to, take a left, even though you probably should take a right. Don't be afraid to wing it a bit, and just sort of go with it, because that's often where the memories are made.
And one of the things I usually ask my guest is along those lines, biggest travel surprises. I mean, or things that have gone wrong on trips that are the most memorable?
Oh, gosh. I've had things go wrong. Well, I am one of these guys who gets to the airport about 18 seconds before they close the gate. They close the door at the gate. And I do remember once
So you're
getting to
saying
an airport.
you give travel advice, you don't take travel advice.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
I have often had to say to family and friends surrounding me, looking at me angrily, going, "Listen, don't tell a lot of people about this because my moniker's a savvy traveler. This would not look good." But I remember the earliest I ever got to the airport was I had given a speech in Wyoming, and I was at I don't know what airport, flying out of a major airport. It wasn't in Wyoming. I don't know if I drove across the border or something, but I got there about 3.5 hours early for my flight. I was going to Boston. I had a good book with me, and I sat down right at the gate, started reading, and looked up about 4 hours later and thought I'd best check in on this flight, and the flight had left a half an hour earlier. I need that tension. I need that being afraid to keep all my wits about me and get there. When I settled in, I just settled in and started reading, I was much too comfortable. I remember I went to what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Russia, on assignment for a magazine called Fame, which no longer exists. Peter Max was having an art opening there, and Peter Max's art, of course, is sort of splashy and Western and could be construed decadent by some, and having a Peter Max show in Leningrad seemed to be newsworthy. The Fame magazine so they asked me to go over and cover this opening of the show. I flew over on a Western airline, but I was coming back on Aeroflot. I'd never flown Aeroflot before, and I had a regular ticket, and God, they had some rule where you had to get to the airport like 4 or 5 hours before the flight, but believe me, my wits were about me because it was winter, and you had to get there like 3 in the morning, and I don't know what the St. Petersburg airport's like now because I've been back, but at the time it was basically a cement, block, freezing cold, smelled of vodka, a lot of surly people who had been up drinking all night and in celebration of being able to take a trip. And for some reason, I went, I said, I don't care how much it costs, give me a first-class ticket. So I got a first-class ticket. So when it came time to board the plane, they march us not through some, heated arm into the plane. You walk out on the tarmac. You entered through the cargo belly of the plane.
Oh, my goodness.
And then walked up these steps into the main body of this enormous Soviet-made jet, passenger jet, with thousands of seats, what look like thousands of seats inside. So everybody goes in and goes to their respective seat. And I find out there's no division between first and coach as there is in most airlines. I mean, you can't tell by the size of the seat or the spaciousness of the cabin. It's all one big cabin. It's all one big football field, and all the seats are exactly the same size and spaced exactly the same. So there's no row of 2 instead of 3. It's 4 and 10 and 4 across. And I'm in the middle of one of these 10, and I'm all by myself. And maybe there are 15 rows totally empty except for me in the middle of it. It's like going in a movie theater, sitting all by yourself in row 4. And then beginning at row 25, every single seat taken up back to row 90. So that anytime I would turn around, stand up to use the lavatory, the entire plane's eyes were fixed on me. Who is this guy sitting in, quote, first class? And in first class, it meant you got 2 free Pepsis in the course of the trip. And they gave you little coupons. I still have one of the coupons. I've saved it. And I remember we took off, and I sort of dozed off, and we stopped, and we weren't in Washington, D.C. yet. Well, it turns out we were in Shannon, Ireland, refueling. I thought, well, okay, I remember as an Army brat refueling in Shannon a lot. Oh, okay, fine. Take off again. I fall back asleep. And we're coming in, we're circling, my ears are starting to pop, and I look down, and it's not Washington, D.C., and I say to the flight attendant, Washington, D.C., and she's going, oh, Washington. I'm pointing out Washington, D.C. It doesn't look like, I know what Washington, I lived there for 40 years. It's a forest. It's a pine forest. And we land in the middle of it, and we're told we all have to get off the plane. And, of course, I'm the first one off because I'm up there in that empty so-called first-class section. And there's a Canadian Mountie standing there. And I said, where the heck am I? And he said, well, you're in Canada, sir, in Newfoundland. I said, well, what are we doing here? And he said, well, these Soviet aircraft gulp so much fuel, they can't make it all the way from Ireland to walk to the east coast of the United States. It was that kind of flight, and I love that story. If I had flown nonstop smoothly on Pan Am, which probably still existed then, I'd have no story to tell you.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned you made reference twice to being an Army brat. You grew up in Germany part of the time and moved around every 2 years. How did that help form your travel habits?
Well, I remember drinking warm milk on a ship because they didn't refrigerate their milk. It was warm milk going from the United States over to Germany when I was 3 or something, I don't know. And I remember hating that. I think my travel habits were formed by my father, the late, great Colonel R.J. Maxa. The colonel, he was stationed in Germany twice. Certainly the last time around when I was in the fifth, sixth grade, I think, fourth, fifth, and sixth, I think. Every weekend we would take a car trip. Looking back on it, it was fascinating. I often didn't enjoy car trips, which we also took when we lived in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, and Huntsville, Alabama, and Cleveland, Ohio, because the colonel would treat trips like a pre-dawn raid on Saddam Hussein's bunker. We would begin with the lights being thrown on my room at like 4:30, and he would say, "Up and at 'em," which for years I never understood what he meant. My name was Adam. He was a nuclear weapons specialist, so I thought, well, maybe it has something to do with the atom. I just didn't get up and at him, for a long time. And so I'd be blurry, and I'd say, well, Dad, why do we have to, couldn't we go at 9? We've got to beat the traffic. Well, of course, we'd still be on the road at 9. We'd hit the traffic anyway. But it was a military operation whenever we traveled. And there was occasionally we'd stop at Howard Johnson's for banana ice cream, which was like the love of my life. But mainly we had to keep driving. It was like we had to get the troops to the front line before their supplies ran out, So he certainly was he was beyond a professional traveler. He was traveling with military precision. So I try to avoid early morning flights as much as I can. Though when I'm shooting the TV series, we're often, up at 4 or 5 in the morning to get to the next place. So I had good training with the colonel.
Now, you've done a series on Europe, and you're just starting now a series on the Pacific Rim, as I understand.
Actually, we've done 5 seasons, and it's 13 shows per season. We've done 4 seasons on Europe, and we have done, our last season was the Pacific Rim. We've done 13 shows on the Pacific Rim, yes. And I'm raising corporate underwriting now for a 6th series, and I think we're going to change the name to Rudy Maxa's World, and we're going to sort of do all kinds of different places so the viewer never quite knows where we are. Maybe a couple in Thailand, a couple in India, a couple in Argentina, that sort of thing. I want to mix it up a little more.
And where do you want to go? Where do you want to add on, as your excuse to travel now, as somebody is going to underwrite your travel? What haven't you seen?
Well, I do a lot of speechifying, and everybody thinks I've been everywhere. And I haven't. I mean, I've certainly traveled more than the average person, but there are world travelers that far surpass the stamps in the passport with me. For example, I have never been to South Africa. Okay. I've never been to Brazil. I've never been to Portugal. Just for some reason, I've never been to Chile. For some reason, there are so many destinations. I've never been to Moscow that have eluded me. So I would like to do some of those places. I'd like to get to know Eastern Europe better. We did a Croatia show, but I would certainly love to go into Estonia and elsewhere in some of the emergent countries there. So there are a lot of places I have yet to go that I'd like to do.
And where that you've been have been your favorites? What really stands out as your favorite destinations?
Well, Asia,
really?
Generally. Thailand, Malaysia. I've not been to Vietnam, by the way. My kids have been, but I haven't been. And I say that, Chris, because I have this theory. People do say, what's your favorite place? And I have this theory that it's what you discover later in life that's often your favorite place.
Okay.
Because I had the good fortune to see a lot of Europe as a boy, I'm quite familiar with Europe. And, of course, we've done now 52 shows in Europe. So in fact, I'm going to Italy next week for 10 days to Rome and the house on the Amalfi Coast with my daughter and her husband and my mother and my brother and his wife, excuse me. So I know Italy fairly well. And I don't mean this the way it sounds, but for me, going to Europe is, it's like when I lived in Washington, D.C. for 40 years, going to New York for the weekend. It's not a big deal. I'll go over for 2 days for dinner if somebody invites me. But I didn't get to Asia until I was 34 years old. My first destination was Hong Kong. In fact, my only destination on that trip was a week in Hong Kong. And I was just blown away by it. I remember standing on the Star Ferry at night, around midnight, and seeing this moon above Victoria Peak. And it was one of those crisp, clear nights in Hong Kong with the city, that amazing cityscape. The skyscrapers lit up like polished diamonds against the sky. And I just went, this is cool. Whoa, I can't believe it took me this long to get here. Similarly, Africa. I didn't get to Africa until I was in my 30s. I've been to Egypt, but I've been to North Africa, Morocco, and Egypt, but I hadn't been to Kenya or Tanzania, and that blew me away. So those are favorite places. But again, I think it's a function of what is new to you.
Sure.
That you discover later in life. I'm convinced if my dad had been stationed in Asia and I never got to Europe till I was 34, I'd probably be gaga over Europe.
Interesting. Most of my listeners, not all of them, are Americans. Where do you think Americans don't go but should?
The same places I didn't go that I should. Asia, South America, Central America, Africa. I think, there is a sort of bias toward Europe, and that's understandable given the makeup of America. So many of us, although, of course, those demographics are changing quickly, but so many of us, particularly I'm a baby boomer, my generation, have European ancestors. So we naturally turn consciously or subconsciously toward the homeland, toward Europe, as an exotic destination. And unless you have business or, just have always had a passion for the desert and want to go to the Middle East or want to go to Africa or South America, we tend to get to those later in life. I mean, I am embarrassed at how little I know about South America and Central America and how little I've been there. I've been to Argentina a couple of times, gave a speech in Ecuador once. That about punches a ticket for me in South America, and I'm not delighted about that,
Well, as we record this, my show today is going to be on Brazil, so just, stay tuned here. But
okay.
as of course, for those of you listening, you'll just have to go back. But you made a case for Asia already. You talked about some of your things there. Any memories that stand out from Africa or South America that really, as you make a case for Americans going there?
Certainly going on safari in Africa, you really feel, I really felt, and I would think others might feel that way, how, well, we bestride this, Earth as colossus, or if there's a plural, colossi, I don't know, but that we are, as long as we got that American Express card in our pocket, our American passport, we can do just about anything. And you get into the jungle and you listen to the sounds at night, and you go, you know what? I'm a little lower in the food chain than I thought, at least around here. You realize that you are sort of low on the food chain, and there is this teeming world of animals that you don't encounter on the streets of New York and don't have to think about when you go out walking, day or night. And that primacy, that sort of fundamental life force that you feel in Africa is something that, unless you're maybe a farmer who grows corn in Nebraska and is very in tune with the land and the weather, or you're a winemaker in California, unless you're really in tune with Mother Nature all the time, most of us who live in big cities, like I have most of my life in the United States, we sort of forget about nature forces, except the extent, it's going to be hot here in Washington, D.C. because summer's coming. That's about as fundamental as we get. Whereas in Africa, you feel the life force so much more strongly. That was certainly what I took away from Africa in my soul. In Asia, I think the influence of Buddhism and other religions in that part of the world, while I'm certainly no expert on any of them, and I would say the same about India, by the way, but the approach to life, the acceptance of life and death is so much different than we North Americans generally experience it. And that was interesting to me, and I think it's brought a little bit of peace to my life, though I'm certainly, not a Buddhist or a Muslim, but I think the religions in that part of the world are fascinating, and again, bring a different life view to folks, and there are probably some calming, peaceful, self-satisfying parts of those religions or those lifestyles that we as Americans might want to adapt and might make the quality of our life a little better.
As you look at the world now, you've been a print journalist and you've gone into radio, somewhat accidentally, it sounds like, and now on to video and even high-definition video, actually, for your newer shows. Do you look at destinations differently now, as you know that you're going to be explaining them visually versus when you were describing them with words back in Savvy Traveler or on the Savvy Traveler show? Well,
yes. Actually, we were public television's first high-definition series, all 65 of our episodes on Europe and Asia and HD, and they're just stunning. It's just stunning. I say to friends, I know if you don't have an HD TV, go over to Costco or Best Buy and just stand there, and you'll be astounded, which I think most people have done now, whether even if they don't have a TV, they do know there's a significant difference in the quality of the picture. I frankly prefer being a writer. That isn't to say I like writing. I hate the physical act of writing. I'm fairly good at it. I can do it very quickly, and I think I do it quickly to get it over with. But with writing, I don't affect the story as much as I do even with a radio microphone. You know, I remember traveling through India once, and our bus broke down, our bus didn't break down. Some local villagers were protesting the government and had put boulders across this very narrow two-lane road. And it stopped traffic for miles. And it had been going on for hours by the time we got there. And India being India, everybody got out and sort of decided to, cook dinner by the side of the bar, cook lunch by the side of the bus and get to know, make some new friends and so on. But of course, as Americans, we had to get someplace, so we're going up to the front line, exploring things. Right? I was doing a series of radio pieces for Savvy Traveler when it was a one-hour radio show on public radio back in the old days. As soon as a headset and a huge microphone came out and a little recording thing, there were 400, well, there weren't 400, there were probably 100 people surrounding me, pressing in, wanting to talk to me, smiling, eager to, and, it's that old scientific, what's it called, starts with an H,
Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Heisenberg, exactly, the Heisenberg theory that watching something changes the nature of what's happening. Mm-hmm. That happens with radio equipment, and certainly with television equipment. High-definition cameras are getting smaller, but they're still fairly good size, particularly the 100% HD ones, as they call them, the true HD.
Sure.
And, you show up with a camera, and all kinds of stuff starts happening that wasn't happening before. So I actually prefer writing because you're a little more discreet, even if you look different from the local populace. They'll give you your space, and you can sort of hang out quietly, and they sort of get used to you being there. If you're sitting in a town square for an hour, they stop noticing you, generally. With radio and television, you have to think about what effect that microphone and that television camera and, lights and a reflector and blah, 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 what effect that's going to have on the story you're doing. So that's certainly a factor to think about. And, of course, when you're shooting in high definition, when you're shooting any television, something happening on the screen is good, and visual beauty and lighting. It's a real pain in the ass, frankly, because, when all you've got is a notebook and a pen, you don't really care whether the lighting's good or not.
Sure.
Or whether it started to rain, or whether there's a jackhammer going up, half a block away. I mean, I don't know the number of stand-ups. I work hard on these shoots because the hard-working people are the photographers and the producers. I mean, I do these stand-ups. I look into the camera and deliver these lines, and then I'm photographed walking down cobblestone streets and so on and interacting at the local market. I mean, my job takes about an hour a day. Theirs takes 12 hours a day. I'm there the whole time, but at any rate, the number of stand-ups that have to be aborted or redone because, oops, a garbage truck just went by behind you. Oops, some guy walked behind you and, put the devil's, made his fingers behind your head look like you're a devil, or reindeer or whatever that's supposed to do. Or an airplane goes overhead, or the sun goes behind a cloud while you're doing two sentences and the light changes too dramatically for the cameraman to capture it, or compensate for it. That kind of stuff. Oh, it just drives me nuts.
The one question I had for you is you've been to so many places now. When do you think was the moment that you thought, this is the furthest I've ever been from home? In whether it be geographically or
right.
culturally or...
Let's see, a couple of places. I'm sort of spinning around the globe here. Certainly in the villages of northern Thailand outside of Chiang Mai. Mm-hmm. I sort of found myself in some farmer's home smoking opium. And I went, whoa, well, this is, this is different. I so rarely do this. Same thing in India. I did a National Geographic Traveler piece that I guess came out last year and went into really, really rural India. I mean, there were no paved roads where I was, and they don't see many white folks down there. And so I'd go into a village, and it was cause for a celebration. And this time they were doing, we camped about a bunch of village elders, and they were consuming opium in a liquid form, which I didn't know you could do. You just slurped it up out of their hands. They passed water through a cheesecloth, and the water went over the brown stuff. And didn't feel anything that time. It was much better in Thailand. But again, it was sort of that feeling that I was sort of taken entirely out of my comfort zone, entirely out of my life and my reality. Being on safari in Africa, although safaris are controlled events, you don't just go out wandering looking for lions by yourself. But certainly that was about as exotic as it could be. And rural parts of China, where at least the first time I went into China, they had never, in the countryside, they'd never seen white people. I was with a woman who had blonde hair, and it was exhausting because you'd walk through this village, and everybody just had to come out and stare. And you sort of felt like the Queen of England, going on parade. And you had to just smile, and after about an hour, you get so tired of smiling, and yes, and hello, and waving, and little children wanting to touch what little hair I had, which was light, and certainly the blonde hair the woman I was with had, just because they couldn't believe it was real. They'd just never seen anything like it. Meanwhile, you're passing open-air barbershops where Michael Jackson, who was then at the top of his game, Michael Jackson songs were blaring out from the tape players or radios. So there's this cultural disconnect of, whoa, look at how weird these people are, but hey, we're playing Michael Jackson.
I often get the impression as I watch one of your shows, for instance, that one of the things you like best about travel is the food.
Unbelievable, Chris. You are so precious. That is amazing. It is. First of all, I do like food. I like thinking about food, and I like thinking about wine, and any sort of local, if it's spirits, Scotch in Scotland, or whatever is the local product. Because whether it's food or drink, the local product tells you so much about the economy and the lifestyles of the people and their history and their culture. And let's face it, a lot of us spend a lot of time eating every day, or thinking about eating our next meal. What is it going to be, or where is it going to be, or with whom is it going to be, and what time is it going to be? And I moved to St. Paul, Minnesota 3.5 years ago because I fell in love with this woman here, and she couldn't move because of certain realities with her children, and so I moved here from Washington and the East Coast, Washington and New York. And I'm still fascinated by the fact that the average business lunch here starts at 11:30 in the morning. In D.C., earliest would be 12:15, but generally 1:15 or so. I remember the first time some guy said, okay, delighted to meet you for lunch. How about 11:30? And I remember pausing and going, I said, well, is the restaurant open? And they said, well, of course it is. And the next time, the second guy said 11:30. I said, finally at lunch, said, well, what's with this 11:30 thing? Isn't this brunch? This is not lunch. And he said, yeah, well, and sure enough, you can sometimes shoot a cannon through the most popular restaurants in the Twin Cities at 1:15, which is when I often started lunch in my previous life. So even on a, United States sort of one city to another basis, there are cultural differences in how people treat food and certainly what they eat. This is a northern climate, so there's a lot more, in most average restaurants, there's a lot more emphasis on heavier food and fried foods and so on. That tells me a little bit, it gives me a little bit of picture of the people who populated this part of the United States and their heritage and what they like to eat and what they do and how they live. So everywhere in the world I go, I love going to markets and restaurants and reading the menus and saying, look, just bring me what you had for dinner last night or what you're eating for dinner tonight.
You talked about food being different in Minnesota. I heard you telling a story about things being carved out of cheese.
No. Well, actually carved out of butter.
Carved out of butter, sorry, right.
Yeah. Wisconsin, they make carved cheese. I don't know, but no, there's an annual state fair here in the Twin Cities. It's the Minnesota State Fair, and it's quite the production. For one thing, there's sort of this competition among vendors to serve food on sticks. So you have all these outrageous, almost entire meals on a stick. You've got hot dogs or wieners that have been rolled in breading, and it's all kinds of weird things on sticks. But there's also a tradition of having a butterball queen, or is it a butterhead queen? I don't know what it's called, but and there are regional competitions, and it's like a beauty contest. I don't know if it's a beauty contest or what, but these women compete, and they become the butter queen, I guess. A local artist sculpts their head in a life-size mound, out of a life-size mound of butter. And of course, it's kept in a refrigerator or freezer, I guess. And then at the state fair, there sort of is the ultimate queen crowned, or that's what it appears to me when I've stopped by. And there's a whole build or section of a building where, during the entire fair, there's a sculptor sculpting these women into butterheads, they're into butter sculptures. And all around you in a frozen display case or in a cold display case are the sculptures of women's heads in butter. And I remember seeing that and going, well, this is certainly odd. About a year ago, I got in my car, because I now drive a car because you sort of have to in this place. And I turned on the ignition and public radio came on. And they were halfway through a report. it was All Things Considered or something. It was one of the national shows. They're halfway through a report on these butter queens and the sculptures. But, of course, they explained the concept before I turned the ignition on, before the radio came on. And I swear, if I hadn't known what they were talking about halfway through this report, I mean, I listened to it because I knew what it was. I was laughing to myself. But if I hadn't known what it was, I wouldn't have understood this report at all. I would have gone, what is this guy talking about? Because he was saying, well, Julie, how long do you keep the butter sculpture of your head in your freezer? Oh, we generally keep it 20, 30 years. And I'm going, what is she talking about? So now I know. But I love regional oddities and things that make one part of the country or one part of the world different from another.
Well, I think I promised you I'd only keep you for 20, 30 minutes, and it's been more like 40. Any last comments for the listeners?
Gosh, Chris, no, I don't think so. It's been a pleasure. Trust me, I could go on for hours, and often do to audiences' regret when I give speeches. But no, I keep it in the time. But I think we've about covered the waterfront for the moment. Anyway, it's a good beginning.
Well, we'll have to have you back then.
Anytime.
Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Nice talking to you, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
I have two travel resources for you today. The first one is Not for Tourist guidebooks at notfortourist.com. Among other things that are nice about this guidebooks is that the entire New York City version of this guidebook is online. And so if you're going to New York City and you're just planning on visiting one or two neighborhoods, then take a look at this, and you can even download the PDFs or look up things ahead of time. The second resource I have for you today is iAudioguide.com. iAudioguide.com provides a series of free city audio guides for a number of different major cities across the world, so check that out if you're planning on going someplace, anywhere from Athens to Zurich. So, iAudioguide.com. In the community section of the show, I hope everybody's checked out the newest version of the video version of The Amateur Traveler. Episode 15 went up last week and covers Eastern Turkey. I'm interested in your feedback. I'm still playing with that show and trying to develop a different style. The last two shows have had audio narration, unlike the first 13, so let me know what you think. Tyrone wrote and said, I ran across your podcast by accident and I love it. I can't really afford to globetrot, so I live vicariously through your podcast. You take me to the places I just love. Thank you, thank you. Tyrone, I also travel vicariously through the podcast. I'm actually sitting here in my room in San Jose, California, not traveling. I've often said that if I traveled more, I wouldn't need to do the podcast, but just don't have the time. And then Rob wrote about an unusual place to listen to The Amateur Traveler. He writes, I discovered The Amateur Traveler podcast several months ago, and I have been truly enjoying listening to it. I normally listen to your podcast while I'm swimming laps 4 days a week. I have a waterproof case and earphones for my iPod, and it makes the time fly by. Since I'm a relatively new listener, I have many historical podcasts to listen to. Today I listened to Swimming with Whales in Tonga, and as the podcast ended, it featured the sound of whales. As I swam along in the pool, I truly felt as though I was right there with the whales. Thanks for your effort. Rob, thanks for sharing that. That's just a great visual. As we close this show, I'd like to ask one favor. I need a few more reviews. The Amateur Traveler has slipped from the featured podcasts in the Places and Travel section in iTunes. If some people could go there and review the show until it showed back up there, that would be terrific. There are many different ways to contact me. Check out amateurtraveler.com/contact. The easiest way is to send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com. And with that, we'll call this show done. Thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, Pod Show, and Limelight.